The average American household now carries thousands of dollars in credit card debt. Every year, banks collect well over $100 billion in interest and fees from people who thought they were simply buying groceries, filling their gas tanks, or taking their children out to dinner. Most people assume that's just how money works. My grandmother didn't. She lived for 84 years and never owned a credit card, not because she couldn't qualify for one. By the 1980s, credit card offers were arriving in mailboxes across America. Millions of families were signing up. Millions more would spend the next 40 years making monthly payments on purchases they barely remembered. My grandmother threw the offers away. Last year, while helping clean out her house, I found a faded Maxwell House coffee can sitting on a shelf above the refrigerator. It wasn't hidden. It had been sitting there for decades. Inside were 7 worn envelopes, a stack of yellowing receipts, and a black notebook with household accounts 1978 written across the cover in blue ink. At first, I thought I was looking at the financial records of a woman who simply hated banks. I was wrong. The notebook told a different story. There were entries for groceries, heating oil, doctor visits, school clothes, and Christmas presents. There were notes about inflation in the late 1970s, when prices seemed to rise every month. There were records from recessions, layoffs, and unexpected emergencies. What I didn't find anywhere in those pages was even more surprising. No interest payments, late fees, minimum balances, or revolving debt. The deeper I looked, the more one question began to bother me. If an ordinary woman with no finance degree, no budgeting app, and no investment advisor could raise a family, pay off her home early, and avoid debt for more than 50 years, what exactly did she know that we've forgotten? Stay with me, because the answer starts with those 7 envelopes in a coffee can and a $0 money system that millions of families once used before banks convinced them there was a better way. The envelopes themselves looked ordinary. They were the kind you could buy at any grocery store for a few cents each. The edges had softened with age, and the pencil writing had faded enough that I had to hold some of them near the kitchen window to read the labels. Groceries, coal, doctor, clothes, Christmas, house, emergency. There wasn't a single envelope labeled debt. That may not sound unusual today, but in 1970, fewer than 1 in 6 American households regularly used a general-purpose bank credit card. Most families still budgeted with cash, handwritten ledgers, or simple envelope systems that had existed for generations. By the late 1980s, however, credit card companies had mailed hundreds of millions of pre-approved offers into American homes every year. Something changed. Families that once divided money before spending it gradually began spending money before earning it. My grandmother never made that transition. One of the entries in her notebook caught my attention. It was dated October 1979, during one of the worst inflation periods in modern American history. Prices were rising rapidly. Mortgage rates would eventually climb above 18%, and many families struggled simply to keep up with everyday expenses. Next to a grocery total of $23.41, she had written a short sentence: "Money has to know where it belongs." At first, I thought it was simply advice. Later, I realized it was the entire system. Financial historians sometimes refer to it as envelope budgeting. Some counselors call it cash allocation. During the Great Depression, many households used similar methods because they simply could not afford mistakes. The principle was remarkably simple. Before money could be spent, every dollar received a job. The strange part is that modern financial advice often arrived at the exact same conclusion, long before budgeting apps and automatic transfers became popular. Ordinary families had already developed a system that required no subscriptions, no monthly fees, and no approval from a bank. And yet, somewhere between the kitchen table and the credit card statement, millions of people stopped using it. The more I read through those notebooks, the more another question began to bother me. If the system worked during recessions, inflation, layoffs, and family emergencies, why did so many people abandon it during periods of greater prosperity? The answer, I would eventually learn, had less to do with convenience than with a quiet change in the way Americans were taught to think about money. And that change began long before most people ever received their first credit card. The modern credit card industry is surprisingly young. When the first bank-issued cards began appearing in large numbers during the late 1960s and early 1970s, they were marketed as a form of freedom. Advertisements promised convenience, security, and a life without financial limits. By the early 1990s, credit cards had become so common that many Americans could no longer imagine daily life without them. But if you go back and read household guides printed before World War II, you find an entirely different language. A 1930 housekeeping manual advised families to separate each expense before it occurs. A farm accounting guide printed during the Depression recommended that household money be physically divided into categories immediately after payday. Even military families during wartime often used labeled envelopes to ration spending because uncertainty made planning essential. My grandmother never called it envelope budgeting. She simply called it putting money where it belongs. As I continued reading her notebooks, I noticed that every payday followed the same pattern. The amount changed. The handwriting changed as she grew older. But the sequence never did. Money for food went into one envelope. Money for heating went into another. Money for emergencies went somewhere else entirely. If one envelope became empty, she didn't borrow from next month's income. She adjusted. Sometimes the grocery envelope became smaller. Sometimes Christmas gifts became simpler. Sometimes repairs had to wait. The rule appeared repeatedly in the margins: never spend tomorrow's money today. That sentence may sound old-fashioned, but economists today would call it delayed consumption. Behavioral psychologists call it mental accounting. Financial planners call it cash allocation. My grandmother simply called it common sense. What surprised me most was discovering that modern budgeting systems had quietly rediscovered many of these same ideas. The cash envelope method, zero-based budgeting, and certain financial counseling programs all rely on one principle: every dollar must have a purpose before it can disappear. The difference is that my grandmother's version costs nothing. No monthly subscription, premium budgeting app, credit monitoring service, or rewards program designed to encourage spending. Just 7 envelopes, a coffee can, and a notebook that sat beside the refrigerator for more than 50 years. And yet, despite its simplicity, something about this system made modern banks deeply uncomfortable. Because a customer who spends only the money they already possess is a customer who generates very little interest. And interest, as it turns out, became one of the most profitable products in modern America. By the time I finished reading my grandmother's notebooks, I had stopped asking whether the system worked. The evidence was sitting in front of me. The house had been paid off. The bills had been paid. 4 children had been raised. Several recessions had been survived. The real question had become something else entirely. If this method was so effective, why did so many people abandon it within a single generation? Part of the answer arrived in my mailbox. Over the course of 1 month, I collected every financial offer that arrived at my house. Credit cards, balance transfers, personal loans, buy now, pay later offers, cash advances, reward programs, 0% financing. There were 12 separate offers. My grandmother's mailbox would have contained none of them. In 1970, American banks earned only a small fraction of their profits from consumer credit cards. Today, revolving debt has become one of the largest and most profitable areas of consumer finance. Interest payments, late fees, and penalty charges generate billions of dollars every year. None of that makes banks evil. But it does create incentives. A family that spends only the money already sitting inside 7 envelopes is extremely difficult to profit from. A family that carries balances from month to month is much more valuable. One earns interest, the other doesn't. As I spoke with several financial counselors, one of them told me something I couldn't stop thinking about. The financial industry teaches people how to manage debt. Previous generations spent more time learning how to avoid it. That difference may seem small. It isn't. Somewhere between my grandmother's kitchen table and today's smartphone apps, budgeting slowly became something people did after the money was gone, rather than before it was spent. The envelopes, notebook, and coffee disappeared. And in their place came statements, due dates, minimum payments, and balances that seemed to follow families for decades. My grandmother never understood why people paid interest on groceries. She wrote one sentence in the margin of her notebook in 1986, beside a newspaper clipping advertising a new credit card. If you must borrow to eat, something has already gone wrong. At the time, I thought it sounded harsh. Today, I'm not so sure, because the more I studied those envelopes, the more I realized they weren't simply organizing money, they were changing behavior. And that's where the real $0 system begins. The following Saturday, I decided to rebuild my grandmother's system exactly as she had used it. I bought 7 plain envelopes from a stationery store for less than $1. I found an old coffee tin in my garage. Then I sat down at my kitchen table with her notebook open beside me. The first rule was surprisingly simple. Every dollar needed a destination before it could be spent. My grandmother never waited until the end of the month to see what was left. The money was divided on payday, while it was still sitting in her hands. Food, housing, utilities, medical expenses, savings, unexpected emergencies, and one small envelope simply labeled life. That last envelope fascinated me. Inside her notebook, she described it as money for things that make hard times easier. Sometimes it paid for birthday presents. Sometimes it bought ice cream for the grandchildren. Sometimes it sat untouched for months. But it always existed. Modern budgeting often treats enjoyment as a mistake. My grandmother treated it as a necessity. The second rule was even more unusual. Money could move backward, but never forward. If the grocery envelope became empty, she could borrow from clothing or entertainment, but she could never borrow from next month's income. No future paycheck was allowed to solve today's problem. One note from 1982 read, "Next month already has its own troubles." As I followed her system for several weeks, something unexpected happened. The anxiety began to disappear. For the first time, every dollar had a purpose before it left my account. I no longer wondered whether I could afford something. The envelopes had already answered the question. Either the money was there, or it wasn't. And that simple answer removed a kind of stress that modern banking often encourages. Because banks make money when balances grow. Credit cards make money when payments continue. But uncertainty may be the most profitable product of all. My grandmother's system did something dangerous. It made money visible. And once money becomes visible, it becomes much harder to spend without thinking. That is why the most important envelope in her coffee can wasn't the grocery envelope, or the emergency envelope, or even the savings envelope. It was the one marked with a single word. Enough. Several weeks after I rebuilt my grandmother's system, I returned the envelopes to the same old coffee can. Not because I had become nostalgic, not because I wanted to live in another century, but because I had finally understood something my grandmother had known all along. The 7 envelopes were never really about cash. The notebook was never really about numbers, and the coffee can sitting above the refrigerator was never simply a place to store money. They were tools for paying attention. Over the last 50 years, financial technology has become faster, smarter, and more convenient. Payments happen instantly. Loans are approved in minutes. Purchases can be completed without touching a dollar bill. Yet millions of people feel more anxious about money than ever before. Perhaps the problem was never that our grandparents lacked modern financial tools. Instead, the problem is that we abandoned some of the habits that protected them. My grandmother never earned a degree in economics. She never read investment books. She never downloaded a budgeting app. But she understood something that many people spend decades trying to relearn. Money has to know where it belongs. One of the final entries in her notebook was written only a few years before she died. There were no numbers beside it, no calculations, and no envelopes listed. Just a single sentence written in pencil. We never had everything we wanted, but we always had enough. For a long time, I thought the forgotten system inside that coffee can was about saving money. Now I think it was about something much harder to find. Enough. And perhaps that is the one thing modern finance still struggles to sell. Because a person who understands what is enough finds it very difficult to persuade others that they need more. The coffee can is still sitting on my shelf. The envelopes are still inside. And every payday, before a single dollar leaves my account, I hear my grandmother's voice reminding me of something that banks, advertisements, and credit cards can never teach. Money leaves faster when it isn't seen.